Well, hi folks. We enjoyed our outdoor service Sunday past, and because it was an invitation service, we branched out from our series in Isaiah and had a look at John's Gospel and the message from chapter 10 about Jesus, the Good Shepherd. But that does mean that we've got a week behind with our studies in Isaiah. And this coming Sunday, Davy will be picking up in chapter 30. And I was supposed to be preaching on chapter 14 last week, had we not had the outdoor service. And so here is the bridge between Paul's last talk, which finished in chapter 9, and Davy's sermon on Sunday, which we'll pick up in chapter 30. You'll remember that we're not studying every chapter or every verse of Isaiah, but we're getting the big story. And you remember the big story so far, that Judah, God's people, have tragically rejected God. They've brought God down. They've elevated themselves. And now because of that, despite God's patience, God has said that judgment is coming. We've had that vision in Isaiah chapter 6 of God high and lifted up, high and holy and exalted. He is patient, but his patience is not without limits. And so for those, including Judah, who have rejected him, dark days lie ahead, dark days of judgment. Listen to chapter 8, verse 22. Then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Specifically, the people are going to be carried off into exile. We've seen that the nation of Judah are surrounded by threatening enemies. They are tempted, of course, to want to make alliances with different nations around them. They think that is their path to security. But the Lord has said no. The only safe place to be is with me. The only safe side to be on is my side, said the Lord. But that message has gone ignored and unheeded by the people of Judah. So judgment is coming in the form of an exile. And yet, despite that, you might think that would be the end of the line. But despite that, God has made it clear that his promises still stand. That in his grace and mercy to his people and in his faithfulness to his word, his promises will be kept. There is still hope to come, at least for a remnant of God's people who will one day return from exile. And one day, God's people will know the blessing of a child who is born, who will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, chapter 9. And so that brings us to the end of that first section of the prophecy of Isaiah. It's a word from God. It's a message of judgment, largely against Judah, his own people, with these notes of hope. But so far, we've seen that there are lots of other nations around as well. We've even seen that God will use some of these nations, like Assyria, to bring judgment on his people. But the question now is, well, if God has such a strong message of warning for his own people, Judah, what message does he have for other nations? Is he oblivious to them? No, not at all. Does he care about what's done in those nations? Yes, absolutely. And so what we have in this next section, largely chapter 13 to chapter 27, is God turning away from speaking about Judah and instead, through Isaiah, giving a prophetic word to nations, lots of different nations around, the Moabites, the Philistines, and so on. And you'll see, for example, chapter 13, verse 1, a prophecy against Babylon that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw. And that prophecy against Babylon continues in chapter 14. So if you've got a Bible, pick it up and read from chapter 14, verse 3. On the day that the Lord gives you relief from your suffering and turmoil, and from the harsh labor forced on you, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has come to an end, how his fury has ended. The Lord has broken the rod of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. This, of course, is looking ahead to the time of exile. Although Judah will be threatened by Assyria, it is the nation of Babylon who in the end will attack and invade and overtake them and carry them off into exile. God will use Babylon as his instrument of justice. But does that mean that Babylon themselves can get away with wickedness? No, not at all. Because God is just and God is powerful. Powerful enough to use even wicked people. Powerful enough even to use the enemy of his people as an instrument in his own hands. And yet completely just, so that all who practice wickedness, be they in Judah or in Moab or anywhere else, in Assyria or in Babylon, can be absolutely sure that they will not escape his justice. So what do we learn here? Well, firstly, as we've seen, we learn the justice of God. Judah will pay for her wrongdoing, but so will Babylon. In the end, with God, there's no way to hide. Be sure, says the scriptures, your sin will find you out. We see something, of course, about God's foreknowledge and God's power. Isaiah is prophesying the downfall of Babylon a long time before it actually happens. And yet his words, well, they come to pass. God does rescue a remnant of his people. God does bring Babylon down in his judgment. And so we see in Judah, in Moab, in Babylon, in Assyria, we see the truth that wherever we are and whoever we are, the wages of sin is death. And of course, that is true for us as well. The wages of our sin and rebellion against God can only lead us in one direction. The wages of sin is death, which of course is why Jesus, the child to be born, the one who will come to declare peace, the one who will be a wonderful counselor, is so precious. Jesus, who goes to the cross to pay the wages of sin on our behalf. God is powerful. He rules over the nations. God is just. He brings his judgment to all. And yet God is merciful. Chapter 9, a child is coming to save God's people from sin. Now, since we're on the nation of Babylon, it's worth saying that I think because Babylon are the nation who carried Judah into exile, elsewhere in Scripture, Babylon almost come to represent all humanity and any nation who set themselves up in opposition to God. So that by the time you get to Revelation chapter 17, you see symbolically the great prostitute, this figure who sets herself up wickedly against God. And she is called, chapter 17, verse 5, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of earth. And this woman, chapter 17, verse 6, is drunk with the blood of God's holy people. So because I think Babylon are the nation that carried Judah into exile, they come to represent humanity set up in opposition against God. And where people or nations set themselves up in opposition against God, well, they set themselves up in opposition against God's people as well, which is just what we see here in Revelation 17. And so whilst this is a message of judgment against the nation of Babylon, it's also a message of encouragement to God's people. Just as the people of Judah faced Babylon as a great enemy, so we too today, as God's people, will find ourselves faced with enemies. Other people, even perhaps other nations, who have set themselves up against God. And as a result, they attack not just God, but God's people. Now, this is very real for many Christians around the world who face severe persecution simply for owning the name of Christ. And we too in the West will find that in the years to come, it becomes more challenging, more difficult to stand for Christ. We will find ourselves, I think, more and more in opposition with the culture around us, with a world, a Babylon, if I can put it that way, that has set itself up against God and in rebellion against him. And so the encouragement of chapter 14 to us is to hang on in there, to keep on trusting God, not to make deals with the world, not to join in with the world, not to set ourselves up in rebellion against God. How could that be the safe thing to do? No, instead, to hang on in there, trusting God when things get difficult, when we face opposition, when standing for Christ really costs us. In those moments, above all, we must remember, as chapter 14 says, that ultimately Babylon, and by that we mean this particular nation of Babylon in chapter 14, but not just this Babylon, every Babylon, that is every person or group or nation that sets itself up in rebellious opposition against God, will ultimately be brought low, will ultimately be judged. Sometimes you hear that phrase, don't you? Are you on the right side of history? Now, typically it's used by politicians or other pressure groups who want to say that their particular progressive agenda is the right one. And if you want to be on the right side of history, you better get with us. You better be for the redefinition of marriage or the abolition of gender and all these sort of things. Get on the right side of history, people say. Isaiah chapter 14 and the surrounding chapters tell us that statement could not be more wrong. Because whatever happens in the short term, at the end of the day, in the long term, the right side of history to be on is on God's side of history. It's a cheesy old phrase, but it's true, because in the end, history is his story. And in the end, he will bring low all who stand in opposition to him. And so the right place, the good place, the safe place to be is to stand with God and to stick with God. Even when pressure comes, to understand that in the end, God's people will be vindicated. In the end, God's enemies will be defeated. So folks, I hope you enjoyed picking up with Davi this coming week in chapter 30 of Isaiah. That gives you a flavour of a bit of chapter 14, but really of chapters 13 to 27, which are all about this message of judgment on the nations. Thanks, folks. See you soon.